Hey guys, so we are back with Old Britannia, and we're looking at a video of his called The War Aims of Each Nation in World War One. Now, I'll admit, of the two great wars, World War One I find the more interesting of the two, and the one that I often want to learn more about. No disrespect to World War Two. I think it's just like it's so oversaturated here in America with the countless movies, and obviously we learn a lot about it at school. So like I kind of have this thing where I guess the saying is familiarity breeds contempt. Not to say I hate it, just like I'm so like exposed to it. I find it not interesting as a subject to cover on my own time. So, but World War One is quite the opposite. I actually really like learning anything I can about this war, and I kind of really want to learn about what everyone's goal was. Mainly the Central Powers is kind of what I want to know what their objective was, and what they had hoped to achieve before, well, they faced defeat. And yeah, I think that's the part I kind of really want to understand, because we all know about why it started, right? Like the constant treaties and alliances everyone made with each other, all kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back definitely was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And yeah, essentially we know what happens from then on out, and the horrors of the Great War. So I'm really looking forward to kind of getting an in-depth look of what everyone wanted to accomplish. Again, I'm really more interested in the Central Powers and what their overall objective was. And yeah, I can't wait to get to it. So before I do though, I need to say, if you want to watch the original video from Old Britannia, the link to the video is down in the description down below. It's always the first link. And if you enjoy my content and want to help out my small but humble channel, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It would help me out a lot, and I would really appreciate it very much. With that said, and now without any further ado, let's get to it, shall we? Let's watch The War Aims of Each Nation in World War One, Part 1, by Old Britannia.
In 1918, the First World War came to a close with a decisive victory for the Entente. The next year, a series of settlements were forced upon the defeated Central Powers, the most famous of which was the Treaty of Versailles, which saw Germany stripped of these lands. 18 months earlier, Germany had imposed its own peace treaty on Russia, in which they took control of a vast swathe of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, that treaty was brutal, what the Germans did, but dang.
Yet these treaties were products of the circumstances in which victory was achieved. For the Entente, it was after the war had become about self-determination, and was increasingly dominated by the United States. For Germany, it was only after Russia had begun to disintegrate as a coherent state. Neither any Entente or Central Power got to ever truly fulfill their desired peace plans, or their vision of a post-war world. This video then will look at the war aims of each of the 5 great powers that entered the First World War in 1914, how they changed, and how they imagined the post-war world. The first power we'll look at is Germany, the principal combatant.
Yeah, this is the one that I wanted to know most about. What would the Germans' ultimate plan if they had triumphed?
Of the Central Powers, and arguably the nation with the most radical vision for a restructuring of the European order. German aims fluctuated throughout the conflict, often depending on who dominated the government at the time. Nevertheless, there were serious proposals on what concessions Germany desired from the war. The first of these is the most infamous, the September Programme, envisaged in 1914 when it seemed like Germany was on course for a quick victory. This was about as Carthaginian a peace as was imagined by any nation in the war. In the west, Germany was to annex resource-rich areas in France such as the Brie region. Belgium was to be turned into a puppet state in control of the Channel ports so as to threaten Britain. Perhaps the most striking thing about this proposal is the remarkable similarity in the east to the land Germany actually took in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk almost 4 years later. It arguably reflects the fact that for most German diplomats, the main war was in the east, where the greatest spoils were to be had for Germany in terms of resource-rich land. Though Germany's war aims in Russia did always remain far more fluid than its demands in the west. Evidently, the September programme was never implemented, at least in the West, as Germany's armies were defeated at the Battle of the Marne. The subsequent descent into trench warfare meant German diplomats saw a favourable negotiated peace rather than total victory as the main aim of Germany's war effort instead. For this, we'll take the often vague suggestions of the German Chancellor until 1917, Bethmann Hollweg. Bethmann was no pacifist, but he was one of the more lucid German policymakers and understood Germany would have to compromise in some aspects. He never offered a set series of proposals, but regarding Western Europe, he envisaged small border corrections with the annexation of Brie and Luxembourg. The terms discussed with the Belgian king in a proposed separate peace in 1916 included the demilitarisation of Belgium and economic dependence on Germany. In the East, his dreams weren't as expansionist as outlined in the September programme, but still aimed for Poland and Lithuania to be declared as independent states. Even so, he did at various points ponder a separate lenient peace with Russia so as to focus on the West. Bethmann was ultimately ousted in 1917, so never got to seriously attempt a negotiated settlement. Next, there was a plan advocated by German Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz.
Okay, so the September program and plan seemed very ambitious, obviously, with taking Belgium, parts of France, and a lot of territory from the Russians. And Bethmann seemed to have a more, well, I would call the September one the best case scenario, or the more optimistic outcome. Obviously, if they had like dominated and whatnot, though I do feel like Bethmann probably was trying to aim for, it felt more realistic, I guess, is the idea you can say, if they could just settle. And obviously with the stalemate that became this war after a while, especially with the implementation of trench warfare, I do feel like Bethmann probably felt the more realistic and grounded outcome in some senses, at least compared to the September one, you know what I mean? So that's interesting.
Who had been instrumental in the creation of Germany's high seas fleet prior to the war. Tirpitz never really got near the levers of diplomatic power, but his plans are interesting for how completely delusional they are. Tirpitz saw the war as a struggle for world rather than European supremacy, thus he believed the British Empire and its command of the sea lanes was the main enemy. To defeat Britain, he advocated signing a white peace with Russia in the east and focusing on the western front, annexing the Channel ports to prepare for the next war, which would be a final clash against Britain. Finally, there was the plan of the Third OHL, dominated by Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
Oh snap.
In case of victory in 1918. This was after peace had been made with Russia in the March of that year. Ludendorff saw Russia's defeat only as a preliminary to total victory in the West. In reality though, there were never any concrete proposals, but we can assume it would have been similar to the September programme. Almost all of these plans came attached with the proposal for a German-led economic union with the rest of Europe that would provide a market for German goods and exclude Britain, generally known as Middle Europa.
Okay, so at least that's the common thread, because there was a bit differences there with Bethmann's, less ambition plan, or, at least compared to the September one, and then there's that idea of war with Britain, and now here's here with Ludendorff. But overall, it seems like, I'm glad he explained the thread that Germany kind of this economic powerhouse, and this thread of it kind of taking the lead, especially compared to Britain and whatnot. So okay, that's interesting that was kind of like the major thread of Germany kind of being the leader and this economic powerhouse for basically the rest of Europe to follow.
Based on a book written in 1915, though it wasn't actually an authoritative policy statement. The common theme here is that this was not a war of survival for Germany. Even supposed compromise pieces aimed to ensure Germany was supreme on the continent for the foreseeable future. In the end, this refusal to compromise meant Germany ended up being completely defeated in 1918, with even Brest-Litovsk being annulled by the Entente. Of all the combatants in the...
Okay, that was the one that I was most interested in, what the Germans wanted from all this. Okay, that's interesting. I'm glad that he finally explained that and that I have a more overall look of what they wanted, though their plans obviously were ambitious and to the point where compromise probably did not help in the long run. But or at least the lack of compromise, you know.
The First World War, France had the single clearest war aim, the reclamation of Alsace-Lorraine.
Hmm.
The territory had been amputated from France in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, and the desire to reclaim the territory had stimulated revanchist sentiment in the country since. The territory was so vital that despite the fact German armies sat deep inside French territory for most of the war, French diplomats almost totally refused to contemplate any negotiated peace that didn't include Alsace. France was also motivated more than any nation by hostility to Germany, which had replaced France as Europe's preeminent power in 1871.
Yeah, we can't forget the Franco-Prussian War that completely humiliated the French. Like it was, I remember we covered that by what was his name, the armchair historian. I can't remember. It's been a while. I apologize if I got his name wrong, but you know what I mean. When we covered that video and just how almost one-sided it felt, and just how Prussia becoming, under the Otto von Bismarck just completely humiliated and, as I would say, dog walked the French. Kind of makes sense that that's still kind of fresh on their mind, right? Was that like one of the last major wars before this that the French were involved in? So, yeah, that it kind of does make a lot of sense that they want to reclaim this territory and obviously have hostility towards the Germans still. Probably the sting of that defeat is still on everyone's mind, right? And it's interesting that this is all they wanted, or at least that was the main goal, right? So I find that very interesting, and yeah, very very clear, very straightforward. We want that back.
Consequently, French war aims were also shaped around finding ways of limiting German power.
Mm.
These ranged from the most hardline stances, that Germany should be balkanised, to the comparatively moderate position that the imbalance between Germany and France should be redressed. One way this could be done was by annexing more German territory. The French for much of the war maintained designs on the coal-heavy region of the Saarland, which would be annexed to increase France's industrial strength. More extensive plans advocated the setting up of a rump Rhinish state to provide security for France, whilst in the early days of the war the French military even considered recreating France's natural borders by annexing all of the left bank of the Rhine. There were other more minor colonial claims, particularly affecting Syria, but ultimately French war aims were almost solely focused on weakening Germany and strengthening France in the European balance of power. In the end, France would reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, but would have to settle for a demilitarised Rhineland and the separation of the Saarland as a League of Nations mandate, eventually to be annexed back into Germany. Russia was a nation that was in enormous...
Okay, so that's interesting. Or at least they got what they wanted, and obviously it did. Germany, as we know, after the war, got really the terms of peace imposed upon them were very brutal. That it's almost inevitable that it led to World War II, right? Like, I forgot the guy who stated it, but they said that after, the peace conference and the agreement upon the end of World War I was more of a ceasefire than an actual peace settlement. Something like that. You guys know what I'm talking about. But yeah, that's just something I find. Yeah, it was almost inevitable, right? But at least France in that kind of got what they wanted, but obviously the way Germany was treated led to the rise of the Nazis and yeah, a lot of things that happened after that, as we know. And yeah, Russia, this is interesting. I wonder if he's gonna talk about imperialistic Russia and what would have happened. Best case scenario if they had remained in the battle and won. As we know, the Russian Civil War happened and the overthrow of the Tsar, and then the Communist Party and the war of the Red versus the White armies. A lot happened in Russia, as we know. So yeah, I'm wondering if he's just gonna talk about imperialistic Russia and what Tsar Nicholas would have had let's just say they done better and managed to stick around, because I know under the Communist Party with like, you know, Lenin and whatnot, that they did try to get peace, obviously, with the Germans, because they had their own stuff within Russia to deal with, and Germany imposed a pretty harsh peace price upon them. So yeah.
Almost perpetual crisis of self-confidence over what the war was actually being fought for. The initial casus belli had been defending a Slavic brother state, Serbia, from annihilation, but as the body count began stacking up, this wasn't a particularly sellable point to the Russian public. When Russia went to war, the Supreme Commander Nikolai Nikolaevich published a manifesto promising the creation of a Polish state within the Russian Empire. The aim was to do this by joining Congress Poland with German and Austrian Polish regions. This would serve the more general Russian aim.
Cursed, I know. Russians' plans for Poland always seem to be quite vague, so this is the best I could come up with. Okay, understandable. Yeah, I find it interesting that the idea of a restored Poland has kind of been brought up several times in this video, and that even from the Russians here, so that's interesting. As we know, Poland does eventually come back. It willed itself back into existence after this war, I believe. So that's cool.
Aim of weakening Germany and destroying Austria as a competitor in the Balkans. The Russians never went as far, though, as to specify the complete destruction of the Habsburgs, for fear that the collapse of this multi-ethnic empire would encourage the Russians' own minorities to rebel. Despite these territorial aims, there was a degree of Germanophilia running throughout the Russian elite, who saw the conflict less as a clash between nation-states, and more as a clash between the liberal West and the autocratic East that Russia just happened to be on the wrong side of. This view was silenced by the entry of Russia's perennial foe, the Ottoman Empire, into the war. The foreign minister Sazonov was able to extract a commitment from Britain and France that Russia would take Constantinople at the end of the war, formerly the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which Russia claimed to be a successor of. The city would also finally give Russia access to the Mediterranean. After the war became an almost holy endeavour against the Muslim Turks, a separate peace with Germany was never seriously discussed, and Russia remained committed to the war effort until the Bolshevik Revolution. The overthrow of the Tsar in the February Revolution did change Russia's war aims, but I won't go into them here. In sum then, Russian war aims looked something like this. In the end, the October Revolution meant Russia instead signed a humiliating peace treaty, only undone because of an Entente victory in the West.
Yeah.
We are a proud nation, founded on...
Okay, yeah, so there was definitely a lot of interesting things here. The Poland proposal there was the one that caught my attention the most. I never thought Russia would just want to give up Poland in any degree, considering Poland was kind of under their thumb, as it were, for a long time. So that was an interesting idea there with Poland. And obviously getting Constantinople is pretty interesting, but as we know what happened, a lot happened there. So yeah. So let me see. Okay, wait. Okay, so Austria-Hungary. Yeah, a lot of this began because of Serbia and Austria-Hungary, right? The assassination of Franz Ferdinand and them wanting to... they essentially wanted this war with Serbia, and I believe even before the war really kicked off, they basically sent them, like, terms that were incredibly... that Serbia could not, you know, follow up on. I think that was like the pretext for them to go to war, right? And yeah, I want to know what the heck they would want. I'm assuming to just completely wreck Serbia, and if not outright eliminate them, at least get them under their thumb, I would imagine. So, I don't know, I guess we'll see. But I'd imagine Serbia plays a part in their goal had they won.
Austria's war aims were what had brought about the conflict in 1914. For a decade, this multi-ethnic empire was plagued by instability in its Slavic areas, because of a resurgent Serbian state that aimed to unify with these regions. Consequently, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by the Serbian Black Hand, the Austrians saw it as an opportunity to crush the Serbs once and for all. Somewhat bizarrely, the Austrians didn't actually intend to annex any of Serbia.
You know, that's something so unique about the Habsburg Empire. It's that it's multinational, right? With the Hungarians and Germans and, you know, the Serbs. But the thing is, that multinationalism kind of ended up, while I think at its prime, a unique place within. At its prime, when things were going well, it was something kind of like a benefit and something unique in just how multi-ethnical it was. But with the rise of like nationalism and national pride among people, it kind of came back to bite them, because obviously, you know, to the point that Hungary started becoming a problem, so they had to change the name from the Austrian Empire to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. As you see, they started losing control, like in Germany, having issues here with the Serbs and whatnot. So at the end, like, people kind of wanted to be a part of their own thing, you know, Serbia, part of the Serbs and whatnot. So, at the end, it just kind of started fracturing. So it was such a unique downfall because of just how diverse it was, right? So, I don't know. I find its downfall incredibly interesting, mainly due to those issues.
They had too many Slavs already, and any more would upset the fragile balance within the Habsburg Empire. Instead, they intended to make sure Serbia would never again challenge Austria, doing this by partitioning it between Bulgaria and Greece, and then turning the rump state into a vassal. Montenegro would have its coastline taken to truly box the Serbs in. In 1915, Italy joined the war against Austria, but the Habsburg lines held thanks to the natural fortifications on the border, and thus only minor territorial adjustments were considered in the event of Italy's defeat. In 1916, Romania joined the war, but was defeated. In 1918, they signed a peace agreement that shows us Austrian aims, which mainly consisted of turning it into an economic puppet of the Central Powers. Russia was Austria's main enemy throughout the conflict, but proposals in case of victory were always vague. There was the so-called Austro-Polish solution to combine Congress Poland with Austrian Poland into an autonomous kingdom under Habsburg rule, but this clashed with Germany's aim for a Polish puppet state. Instead,
yeah, the chess playing everyone is playing with Poland is the interesting part. I find that the most interesting tad bit of information we've gotten in this video. How everyone just wanted to use Poland, and kind of the idea of kind of restoring Poland, though obviously as a puppet to some, or vassal as it were, but still, like, at least the idea of it I still find super interesting, you know?
It was generally thought Austria would share in the economic spoils of the rump states Germany carved out of Russia, something they largely achieved in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Ultimately, Austria's war aims consisted little in the way of major territorial changes, but simply what Austrian diplomats thought would secure the empire's future, something that was looking increasingly bleak as the war continued.
Yeah.
Britain entered the war with no territorial ambitions, and this remained consistent, at least in Europe. Her main casus belli had been Germany's invasion of Belgium, and Belgian independence remained Britain's main demand throughout the war. For Britain, the destruction of the German High Seas Fleet, which challenged the Royal Navy's dominance in the North Sea, was also a crucial aim. Those were by and large what Britain focused on, but a secondary aim was maintaining a balance of power in Europe.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, Britain has definitely proposed itself sort of as this, like, force, or, you know, to keep the balance of power in Europe, right? That was kind of like something about the Napoleonic Wars, under the pretext of, oh, we need to curb France's power, we can't let them become too powerful over the rest of Europe. And and the UK kind of had this idea of just jumping in and helping keep things stable, you know, kind of this overarching force, which I find very unique that they took that. I mean, granted, a lot of European nations actually did go with that because no one wanted one getting too strong. But yeah, and obviously with the idea of keeping Belgium there, it plays a part into that. And also, the whole thing is with the UK is that the saying Britannia rules the waves, and with the rising of the German Navy, them being challenged in that front is something they can't allow, right? So, yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Seems to stay the course for the UK, you know?
In practice, this meant restricting German expansion. To do this, they tied other allies' war aims, such as the French demands for Alsace-Lorraine.
Okay, I want to comment this. I find it hilarious how this started, right, with Franz Ferdinand and Austria-Hungary and Serbia's beef, and then like everyone else kind of jumped in due to treaties and stuff, and then all these other great powers are just like, we want to limit the Germans. It really, the Germans became such the central focal point for a lot of these guys' plans and stopping them. You know what I mean? I don't know. I find that very funny. And that's the thing though, like Germany kind of did take the biggest stage of the Central Powers, even though it's just funny to think they weren't like the cause of any of this in a sense, but yeah, they became like the biggest menace to everyone else. So yeah.
To their own, seeing it as a way to weaken Germany. This is not to say Britain had no territorial aims of its own. Once the Ottomans entered the war, the Middle East in particular became an area of interest to Britain. This was carved up in a treaty known as Sykes-Picot today, which gave Britain influence over these regions. Despite this, of all belligerents, British war aims were the most flexible, as would be seen at Versailles, when Britain attempted to facilitate an awkward compromise between the idealistic Americans and revanchist French. In the end, they were mostly achieved. Belgium was liberated, the High Seas Fleet was scuttled by the Germans, and the Middle East was partitioned, though Britain quickly reverted to its favoured method of informal empire after the peace treaty. Perhaps most importantly, however, Britain failed to preserve a balance of power on the continent. The war saw the destruction of the Austrian Empire, whilst the Russians turned insular. That left just France and Germany, and out of these, Germany was always going to be the most powerful once its strength recovered. One interesting theme in all of these is that war aims didn't necessarily get more harsh as the war went on. The September programme was about as harsh a piece as anything Germany would have come up with in 1918. What's more striking is the increasing intransigence of all belligerents to avoid coming to a settlement. As all policymakers failed to find a compromise to the crisis of 1914, so they failed to find one that could have brought the war to a close.
Change is inevitable.
So yeah, there's actually a part 2 to this, which I'll be covering tomorrow. So this was very interesting. I'm very happy to see what the Central Power... I mean, I'm assuming next video the Ottomans have to be mentioned and what they wanted from all this. But I'm really happy to have covered a deeper look into what everyone was hoping for and their best case scenario, right? In a sense of what they wanted. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to carrying this on tomorrow, and I'll see you all then, everyone. Take care.